There's a certain kind of quiet you only get when you camp alone. Not silence. Just the absence of other people making decisions near you. No group plans, no shared fire talk, just you, the weather, and whatever you packed. That's why I went. I work in logistics. My entire job is anticipating problems before they happen. That weekend, I wanted something simple enough that nothing required anticipating. I drove up toward Dahlonega on a Friday afternoon in November 2017. Light rain the whole way. Not enough to cancel anything, just enough to keep most people home. I turned off onto a Forest Service road I'd used once before. Gravel, shallow ruts, puddles collecting in the low spots. I took it slow. About 40 minutes in, I found a small clearing with an old fire ring. The ridge behind it rose at a steady angle, maybe a couple 100 feet up. From where I parked, you could see the top line of trees against the sky. I liked that. It made the space feel defined. I set up my tent under a tarp, angled for runoff, got a small fire going just at the edge so the smoke would drift away from the tent opening. Nothing complicated. I heated up a pre-packed meal, ate standing up, listened to the rain on the tarp. It felt normal. That's important. Nothing about it felt tense or exposed. Right before full dark, I stood up to stretch and looked toward the ridge. There were 3 pale shapes near the top. At first, I didn't even register them as people. Just lighter patches against darker trees. Then my brain adjusted and decided hikers in rain ponchos. That made sense. The Appalachian Trail cuts through parts of that area. Late season hikers trying to finish a section before winter. They weren't moving. That was the only thing that didn't fit. Even when people stop, they shift weight, adjust straps, turn their heads. These shapes just stayed in place. I watched for maybe 15 seconds. Then I looked down to add a piece of wood to the fire. When I looked back up, there were only 2. I assumed the third had stepped behind a tree or moved along the ridge. A minute later, there was 1. The last one remained slightly offset from where the others had been. Then it also dipped out of sight. No movement down the slope. No side-to-side travel. Just gone. I stayed standing there longer than necessary, expecting to see them reappear lower on the ridge. They didn't. Dark settled quickly after that. The rain got a little steadier. I packed everything back into the car except my sleeping bag and a small lantern. I don't leave food out overnight. Inside the tent, the space felt tighter than it had earlier. That's normal once it's fully dark. I turned off the lantern and lay there listening to the rain. Sometime later, I don't know exactly how long, I heard something separate from the rainfall. Footsteps. Not close. Higher up. If you spend enough time outside, you learn the patterns of animal movement. Deer step unevenly. They stop often. They scrape. This was more consistent. It sounded like more than one set. I shifted onto my side and focused on it. The rain made it faint, but every few seconds I caught it again. The sound was descending the slope. That didn't automatically mean anything. Public land. People move around. But they weren't heading toward the road behind my campsite. They were coming down toward the clearing. I reached up and turned off the small lantern I'd left clipped inside the tent. If someone was above me looking down, I didn't want light outlining the tent walls. The steps continued. Not rushing, not sneaking either, just steady. I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. The rain was light enough that I could hear better once I was out. The footsteps stopped. Not faded. Stopped. I waited there, trying to separate rain from movement. Nothing. I walked toward my car with my keys already in my hand. I told myself I was grabbing something from the trunk. That explanation felt easier than admitting I wanted the option to leave. Halfway there, something landed in the leaves behind me. Small, solid. A rock. Not thrown hard, just enough to hit the ground with intention. I didn't look back. I got into the driver's seat and shut the door quietly. When I started the engine, the tire pressure warning light came on immediately. I paused. I shut the engine off and stepped back out with my flashlight. The front passenger tire looked lower than it should. Not flattened, just soft. The rear tire on the same side looked similar. I crouched and pressed into the rubber. It gave easily. There were no visible cuts. If they had been slashed, that would have been obvious. These looked like small punctures. the kind that leak gradually, which meant they hadn't just happened in that moment. I went to the trunk and pulled out the portable air compressor I keep for long drives, plugged it in, started filling the front tire. While it ran, I listened. Rain. Then another small impact against the rear of the vehicle. Metal this time. I swung the flashlight toward the tree line. Nothing reflected back. No headlamps, no movement. The compressor hummed louder than I liked. I filled the tire just enough to move, then did the rear. Another rock hit, higher this time near the rear window. Not hard enough to crack it, just enough to remind me they were there. I didn't try to top the tires off. I just needed them functional. I got back in, locked the doors, and eased forward onto the service road. I kept it slow, under 15. The road was narrow, and if I damaged the rims, I'd be stranded completely. For the first 100 yards, nothing happened. Then something struck the back of the vehicle again. Not constant, spaced out. It didn't feel random. I didn't accelerate. I focused on staying centered between the ruts. After a few minutes, the trees thinned and the road widened slightly. I pressed the gas harder. The impact stopped. I drove without turning on music, without checking my mirrors more than necessary, just watching the road. When I hit pavement, I kept going until I reached a gas station with overhead lights. I parked under the brightest section and got out. Both tires were still losing air slowly. The next day back home, a shop confirmed 2 small punctures, clean, narrow entries. Not road debris according to the mechanic, but he couldn't say for sure. He asked where I'd been driving. I told him gravel roads. He nodded like that explained it. Maybe it did. What I can't explain is the timing. 3 pale shapes at dusk, footsteps descending only after full dark, tires compromised in a way that didn't disable the car immediately. Just enough to delay me, and rocks thrown not to injure or destroy, but to apply pressure. It didn't feel chaotic, it felt measured, and that's the part I still think about. There's a version of camping that looks romantic in pictures, and then there's the version that's just practical. You pick a spot you can leave in a hurry if you need to, you keep your food put away, you don't do anything that would make you dependent on someone else's help. That's the version I like. In August of 2022, my boyfriend and I drove up near Flathead Lake. We weren't in a campground. We wanted distance from other people, but not the kind of distance where you're doing something reckless. He'd found a spot online that sounded quiet, lakeside, enough tree cover for shade, far enough off the main roads that you wouldn't have headlights passing by all night. We both work jobs that make you appreciate uneventful nights. I'm a nurse. I've spent plenty of nights under fluorescent lights, listening to alarms and footsteps and doors. When I'm off, I want my brain to stop scanning. The drive-in was longer than we expected. The last stretch was washboard gravel, dust in the daylight, mud in the shade. We passed a couple of side turnoffs that looked used. Then the road narrowed and we saw the lake through the trees. During the day, the place was almost too nice. The water was still, and when the sun hit it, it looked like a sheet of metal. The air smelled like pine and damp earth where the shade held onto last night's moisture. You could hear a bird now and then, a small sound that didn't carry far. We picked a flat area a little back from the shore, not right on the water, because I've been around enough mosquitoes to learn. We set the tent with the door facing the car, mostly out of habit. The car was close, but not so close we'd sleep with headlights in our faces if we opened a door. It was the kind of afternoon where you don't do much on purpose. We sat in camp chairs, ate snacks, watched the light change on the water. He skipped stones for a while. I walked the shoreline and picked up a few pieces of driftwood that were dry enough to burn later. Not because we needed a fire for warmth. It was August, but because a fire makes the evening feel like an event. By the time it started getting dim, we'd built a basic fire ring with rocks. Nothing elaborate. We lit a small fire and cooked on it. The smoke drifted out toward the lake. It was calm enough that it went straight up at times, then shifted gently. No wind, no weather coming in, just a soft temperature drop that made the air feel cleaner. If I'm honest, my guard was down. Not in a dumb way. More in a way where my thoughts stopped being sharp. That's the point of going. We ate, cleaned up, put all food and trash in the car. We sat by the fire until it was mostly coals, talking about things that didn't matter. We both had that slow, tired feeling you get from being outside all day. Before we went to bed, we put the fire out fully. That's not a personality quirk. That's just me. I've seen what happens when someone assumes something is probably fine. We poured water on it until it hissed. We stirred it with a stick until we didn't see orange anymore. We poured more. My boyfriend leaned in and held his hand over it to check the heat. We did it again. When we were done, it was wet black ash, no glow, no heat coming off it. The rocks around it were dark and slick. I remember saying, "That thing is done." He said, "Yeah, it's dead." We went into the tent, zipped it, and settled in. The lake was quiet. No waves, no boat motors. The only sounds were small ones, fabric shifting, insects, the occasional snap of a twig that could have been anything. I fell asleep fast. I woke up at 2:40 a.m. I know the time because the light woke me before I even touched my phone, and when I did, it said 2:40. I wasn't waking up naturally. Something pulled me out of sleep. At first, I thought it was the moon. Then I realized the light was wrong. It was orange and moving. Not flickering like a candle right next to you, but shifting enough that the tent fabric brightened and dimmed in slow pulses. My boyfriend was awake too. I could tell by how still he was. "Do you see that?" I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. He said, "Is that our fire?" We both sat up. The glow was strong enough that it lit the seams of the tent. For a second, my mind tried to produce the easiest explanation. We didn't put it out. We were tired. We missed something. It reignited. But even before I looked, I knew that didn't fit. Wet ash doesn't turn into a bright orange glow like that. Not without help. I unzipped the tent a few inches, just enough to see out without opening the whole front. The fire was burning. Not embers. A full fire with flames high enough to throw light into the trees. It wasn't a small accidental flare. It looked built. There were pieces of wood stacked in a way that made the flames stable, like someone had arranged it with intent. I stared at it longer than I should have. My brain was trying to catch up, like it needed an extra few seconds to accept what it was seeing. My boyfriend whispered, "We drowned that." "I know," I said. He reached for his flashlight. I grabbed his wrist without thinking. "Don't," I said, and I hated how sharp it sounded. He paused. Using light felt like turning ourselves into a marker, like saying, "Here we are." He let go of the flashlight and leaned forward to look out through the opening I'd made. Then he said, "Where did that wood come from?" That was the other thing. The pieces in the fire were not the scraps we had left. We'd burned most of what we collected. What was burning now looked like someone had brought in fresh wood, cleaner bark, thicker pieces, some of it arranged like a simple log cabin stack. My skin went tight along my arms, not from cold, just from the situation shifting. We listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no zipper sounds from another tent, no car doors. The lake was still quiet. I pulled the zipper down a little more and leaned out. I scanned the tree line and the shoreline. No headlamps, no silhouettes. We were alone out there, except for whoever made that fire. My boyfriend said, "Maybe someone's messing with us." It was the first time he said something out loud that tried to make it smaller. People do that. I do that too, when something doesn't fit and you want it to fit anyway. But a messing with us that involves a fire you go to sleep next to is a specific kind of choice. He shifted like he was going to climb out. "Wait," I said. "Listen." We both went quiet. That's when we heard it. Laughter, faint and thin, coming across the lake. It wasn't close. It was far enough that it carried strangely, like it was hitting the water and bouncing. I couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from, which side, which distance. It sounded like more than one person, but the echo made it smear. It didn't sound drunk. It didn't sound like kids running around a campsite. It sounded like someone laughing at something they could still see. My boyfriend whispered, "That's over the water." I didn't answer. I was trying to decide what mattered more, the laughter or the fire. The fire was the immediate problem. If that caught something, it wouldn't matter who was laughing. He moved anyway, slowly, and unzipped the tent. I followed. The ground was cold under my feet. I remember noticing that detail because it made everything feel too real. He stood between me and the fire, like that would help. The fire crackled louder than it had earlier. It had that steady sound of a fire that's been going long enough to establish itself. The heat hit our faces. He reached for a stick on the ground and started pushing dirt toward it. I grabbed the water jug we kept near the tent and poured. The flames dropped, then flared again like they were resisting. That shouldn't have been possible given what we'd left. The laughter continued for a few seconds, then stopped. Not faded. Stopped. That silence felt like a response. We kept working anyway. Pour, stir, pour. My boyfriend kicked dirt in with his shoe. It took longer than it should have, and that's something I keep coming back to. If it had been a few embers, it would have been quick. This wasn't. When it finally went down to steam and dark, we stood there breathing hard and listening, waiting for the next sound. Nothing. The trees were dark walls. The lake was black. The only light was the faint outline of the sky. My boyfriend said, "What the hell?" He sounded smaller than usual. He doesn't get rattled easily. I said, "We're leaving." He didn't argue. We packed fast, not carefully, not neatly. Sleeping bags shoved into the back seat, tent poles pulled and tossed, stakes yanked out with one hand. I didn't even roll the tent. I just collapsed it and jammed it into the trunk. The entire time I kept looking into the woods, expecting to see someone step forward, expecting to hear a voice say it was a joke. No one appeared. At one point, my boyfriend whispered, "Do you see anything?" I said, "No." He said, "Me neither." We didn't talk more than that. Talking felt like it would give the place permission to answer. When we got in the car and shut the doors, I locked it immediately. My hands were shaking enough that I had to press the button twice because I wasn't sure it worked the first time. He started the engine and backed out. Headlights cut across the trees in the spot where the fire ring sat. The wet ash looked like a dark stain. Nothing moved in the light. The road out felt longer than it had on the way in. Every time the headlights swept across a gap between trees, I expected to see a face or a reflective strip on clothing. We didn't see anything. We drove until we hit pavement, then kept driving until we found a 24-hour gas station with other cars in the lot. We parked under a light and just sat there for a minute without getting out. My boyfriend stared straight ahead. I said quietly, "If we hadn't woken up." He nodded once. He didn't say anything else. On the drive home the next day, we tried to make it fit into a story that sounded reasonable. A prank, someone wandering by. Kids, another camper who thought it would be funny. But the more I ran it through my head, the less it worked. A prank usually has a payoff. Someone wants to see your reaction. Someone wants to hear you yell. Someone wants to film it. Whoever did that didn't want to be seen. They got close enough to rebuild a fire, and they left without making noise. They never came into the headlights. They never spoke. And if it was across the lake, that meant they were far enough away to watch from a distance. The part I can't stop thinking about isn't even the laughter. It's the steps you would have to take to do what they did. They had to approach our camp while we were asleep. They had to find wood quietly or bring it. They had to arrange it and light it without waking us. Then they had to leave before the fire got too big, or maybe they didn't care if it did. I've spent enough nights working around accidents to know how many of them begin with something that could have been stopped early. That night, we stopped it early because my body woke up at the right time for no clear reason. I don't tell people the story often because it sounds like something you'd exaggerate without meaning to. But I know what we saw. I know how dead that fire was when we went to bed. And now, anytime I'm camping and someone says, "It's fine, it'll burn out," I don't argue. I just get up and put it out myself. Because I learned something I didn't want to learn. You can do everything right and still wake up to a fire you didn't build. I'm not someone who grew up camping. I didn't have that childhood where you know how to tie knots before you know long division. I'm an accountant. I like things predictable. I like numbers because they don't improvise. In April of 2021, I needed a few days where nothing asked anything from me. Tax season had just ended, and I felt like I'd been indoors for months. Moab seemed like a place where space itself would do the work of clearing my head. I drove out alone. I told people where I was going. I had extra water in the trunk. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted quiet. The desert outside Moab has a strange effect during the day. You can see so far that it feels open in a reassuring way. The horizon is clean. The rock formations look fixed and permanent. There's no clutter. I found a remote pull-off off a dirt road that branched away from the more popular areas. No marked campsites, just open land, scattered brush, red rock in the distance. I parked on relatively level ground and set my tent about 15 feet from the car. I positioned the tent so that when I unzipped it, I'd be facing the vehicle. That wasn't a fear decision. It was practical. If I needed something in the night, I wouldn't have to turn around to find it. The evening was uneventful. I heated up something simple on a small camp stove, watched the sky fade from orange to deep blue. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared, but I'd planned for that. I pulled on a thicker layer and crawled into my sleeping bag earlier than I normally would at home. There's a kind of silence in the desert that's different from forests. In a forest, you expect movement. Leaves, branches, animals shifting. In the desert, sound carries in unpredictable ways. A small noise can seem far away. A distant sound can feel close. I locked my car before I went into the tent. I remember pressing the key fob and seeing the lights blink once. I fell asleep faster than I thought I would. The first time I woke up, it was to a sound I recognized immediately. A car door closing, not slamming, just that solid, hollow thunk of a door being pushed shut. I opened my eyes and stayed still. I didn't reach for my phone right away. I just listened. No engine started, no footsteps followed, no voices. I told myself it was wind. That explanation didn't fit perfectly, but it was the easiest one available. If the wind had caught the door at the right angle, maybe it moved. Maybe I hadn't shut it fully. Maybe the lock hadn't engaged the way I thought it did. I lay there for a minute longer. Nothing else happened. The desert air felt colder now that I was awake. I turned onto my other side and tried to let it go. I don't know how much time passed before I heard it again. This time, it wasn't the full closing sound. It was softer, like the sound a door makes when it's pulled almost shut but not fully latched. A slight metal contact, then a small shift. I sat up. I could see the outline of my car through the tent mesh. It was just a darker shape against a dark background. No interior light was on, no headlights, no movement around it. I considered unzipping the tent and stepping out. I didn't. Part of that was practical. If it was nothing, I didn't want to stand outside in the cold for no reason. Part of it was something else. I didn't want to step out and confirm that I was alone and exposed in that much open space. I stayed inside. I listened for a long time after that. Every small sound felt amplified. A faint brush of wind against the tent, a shifting pebble, the fabric moving when I adjusted my weight. But I didn't hear the door again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell back asleep. When I woke up for real, the sun was already lighting the inside of the tent. The warmth hit fast once the light came over the horizon. Desert mornings are abrupt like that. For a few seconds, I forgot about the door. Then it came back to me. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The driver's side door of my car was slightly open, not wide, not enough to look obvious from a distance, just not fully closed. The gap was small, but it was there. I walked toward it slowly, trying to replay the night in my head. Maybe I hadn't shut it completely when I grabbed something from the trunk earlier. Maybe I'd been distracted. I reached the door and pulled it open fully. The interior light came on faintly, then dimmed. It had clearly been on long enough to drain the battery down. I sat in the driver's seat and turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click strong enough to suggest it might try. I tried again. Same result. The desert that had felt wide and calming the day before now felt indifferent. I stepped out and looked around. There were no other cars nearby, no tents, no fresh tracks that I could immediately identify as not mine. The dirt and sand in that area were uneven and windswept. Any clear footprint would have needed weight and moisture to hold its shape. It was dry. I walked a small circle around my campsite. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. A shoe print, a cigarette butt, something dropped. There was nothing obvious. I checked my phone. No service. I had water. I had food. I wasn't in immediate danger. That's what I told myself. This was an inconvenience, not an emergency. But inconvenience in a remote desert can stretch into something else if it lasts long enough. I opened the trunk and stared at the jumper cables. I don't know why. There was no one there to connect them to. I thought about walking back to the main road, but I didn't know exactly how far I'd driven off it. The turns had blurred together the day before. I decided to wait. The sun climbed higher. The temperature rose quickly. I moved my camp chair into the sliver of shade cast by my car and sat there watching the dirt road in the distance. Hours passed slowly. I kept going back to the door. If wind had opened it, it would have had to overcome the latch and the lock. If it had been fully open during the night, I think I would have heard more than just a closing sound. The gap I saw in the morning looked intentional, like someone had pulled it close but not let it click shut. At one point, I opened the door and sat in the driver's seat again. I looked at the steering wheel, the dashboard, the passenger seat. Nothing was disturbed. But the idea that someone could have opened that door while I was asleep and stood there, close enough to see the inside of my car, shifted something in me. Around late morning, I saw two figures moving along a distant trail. Hikers. They were far enough away that I had to stand and wave both arms to get their attention. They hesitated, then changed direction and approached. They were a couple, maybe in their late 20s, normal, friendly. They asked if everything was okay. I said my battery had died. One of them pulled a portable jump starter out of his pack. He said they carried it just in case. He connected it, told me to try again. The engine turned over immediately. Relief came fast, but it didn't erase the night. I thanked them more than necessary. They stayed a few minutes, made sure the car was running smoothly, then headed back to the trail. I packed up quickly after that. I didn't linger. When I drove away, I checked my mirrors more often than usual. The open land looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Nothing in it indicated that someone else had been near me. On the way home, I replayed the sounds in my head. The first close, solid. The second, softer adjustment. If someone had opened the door and then changed their mind, they could have pulled it almost shut to avoid the louder latch sound. If someone had sat in the driver's seat for a moment, they would have been close enough to see my tent 15 feet away. I don't know which possibility is worse, that it was wind and I misjudged something simple, or that someone tested how close they could get without waking me fully. I still camp. I didn't stop. But now, when I park, I don't just hit the lock button and watch for the blink. I walk around and physically pull each handle. And when I wake up in the middle of the night and hear something that sounds like a door, I don't lie there convincing myself it's nothing. I sit up and listen until I'm certain. I've been teaching high school long enough that I've developed a habit of explaining things away before they turn into something bigger. A student says something odd, you don't react immediately. You ask a question, you assume there's a reason. That mindset follows me outside of work. In May of 2019, I went camping in the Ozark National Forest with a friend of mine, Daniel. We'd done trips like this for years, nothing extreme. Just 2 nights, basic gear, food in a cooler, a couple of folding chairs, and a lot of talking about things we never had time to talk about during the school year. The drive-in was familiar. A long stretch of paved road, then gravel, then a narrower dirt road with branches leaning in from both sides. The forest in that part of Arkansas feels dense without being overwhelming. Thick green canopy, rolling hills, enough bird noise during the day, to remind you you're not alone. We found a clearing we'd used once before. It wasn't marked, but there was a worn fire ring and a flat patch that fit 2 tents easily. No other cars nearby. No fresh tire tracks, except what looked like old ones pressed into dried mud. We set up without thinking much about it. His tent on one side of the clearing, mine on the other, with the fire ring in between. The cooler went on top of a folding table a few feet from the fire ring. It was one of those hard plastic coolers with a tight lid and 2 side latches you had to snap down firmly. We cooked simple food that night, burgers on a small grate over the fire. We cleaned up thoroughly. Trash went into a sealed bag in the back of my truck. Cooler lid latched. I remember pressing both sides down with my palm to make sure they clicked. It rained lightly overnight. In the morning, I stepped out of my tent and walked toward the table. The cooler lid was open. Not wide open. Tilted up at an angle, resting against the hinge. The latches were undone. For a second, I assumed Daniel had grabbed something early and forgotten to close it. He came out of his tent a minute later, stretching. "Did you get into the cooler already?" I asked. He looked at it and frowned. "No." We both walked over. The food inside looked untouched. The ice had melted a bit from the warmer air, but nothing was scattered. No bite marks, no claw scratches on the plastic, no tipped over drinks. "Raccoons?" he said. "Maybe," I said. It made sense on paper. Raccoons can get into almost anything. But I've seen what raccoons do to coolers. They don't carefully lift a lid and leave everything arranged. They knock things over, they drag items out. There were no food wrappers on the ground, no paw prints in the soft dirt near the table. Still, animals were the easiest explanation. We checked the latches. They worked fine. We pressed them down again firmly. "Let's just move it closer to the tents," Daniel said. We lifted the cooler off the table and set it on the ground between our 2 tents. That way, if something tried to mess with it again, we'd hear it. The rest of the day was normal. We hiked a short trail nearby, came back, made sandwiches from the cooler. Everything inside was exactly as we'd left it. We joked about stealth raccoons and left it at that. That afternoon, we both left the clearing for about an hour to explore a creek we'd passed on the way in. We didn't take the cooler with us. When we came back, I noticed it before I even reached my tent. The cooler lid was closed, not just resting shut, latched. Both sides snapped down. I stopped walking. Daniel walked into me from behind. "What? Did you come back early?" I asked. "No." We both stared at it for a few seconds. "I didn't touch it," he said. "I didn't either." I walked up and crouched next to it. I pressed on the latches. They were secure. For a moment, I wondered if we'd left it closed that morning and misremembered the lid being open. But that didn't line up. We'd both stood there looking at it tilted up. We'd talked about raccoons. We'd moved it. If an animal had opened it in the morning, why would it close it again later? And latch it? "That's weird," Daniel said quietly. We stood there longer than necessary. The clearing felt the same as it had before. Sunlight through leaves, insects moving in the brush. No voices, no snapped branches. "Maybe one of us closed it without thinking," he said. "I don't think so." He shrugged. "It's a cooler." He wasn't wrong. It was an object. It wasn't proof of anything. We left it there and tried to let it go. That night, we cooked again and made a point of checking the latches twice before going to bed. I pressed them down until I felt resistance. Daniel tugged on the lid to confirm it wouldn't lift. "Happy?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. The forest got quiet earlier than the night before. No rain. The air felt still. I lay in my tent listening to the usual small sounds. An insect tapping against the fabric. Leaves shifting somewhere beyond the clearing. Sometime after midnight, I heard something that didn't match the others. It was a slow, steady sound near the entrance of my tent. Not scratching, not chewing. More like pressure along the zipper line. A slight pull. Then a pause. Then another small pull. I stayed still and listened. It wasn't the random movement of an animal brushing against the tent. It followed the vertical path of the zipper, from bottom to slightly higher, then stopping. I waited for Daniel to say something from his tent. He didn't. Another tug, slightly firmer. I cleared my throat loudly. The sound stopped, not faded. Stopped. I waited. Nothing. "Daniel," I said quietly. A second passed. "Yeah," he answered. "Did you hear that?" A pause. "Yeah." "What did it sound like to you?" "Like someone pulling on your zipper." He said it flatly. No humor in it. We both stayed inside our tents. "Animal?" he said after a few seconds. "I don't think so. Animals don't test zippers like that. They scratch, they paw, they bite." This felt exploratory. Linear. I considered grabbing my flashlight and unzipping the tent to look. I didn't. Part of me didn't want to confirm anything. Part of me didn't want to open the barrier that, thin as it was, felt like something. We waited in silence for several minutes. Then it happened again. This time on Daniel's tent. A slow drag along the zipper line. Not forceful. Not rushed. He inhaled sharply, then said nothing. He shifted inside his tent deliberately, making enough noise to signal awareness. The movement outside stopped. We didn't speak again after that. At some point, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion, because the next thing I remember is gray morning light. I unzipped my tent quickly and stepped out. The cooler sat exactly where we left it. Closed, latched. The ground around the tents looked mostly undisturbed. The dirt was dry and hard-packed. There were some vague depressions, but nothing clear enough to identify as a shoe print. Daniel came out a minute later. We didn't joke about it that morning. We packed without lingering. Cooler into the truck, tents down, fire rings scattered. Before leaving, I walked the perimeter of the clearing slowly. I checked behind trees near the edge where the brush thickened. There were no other tents, no parked vehicles hidden out of sight, no cigarette butts, no trash, just forest. On the drive out, we talked through possibilities. "Maybe someone walked through and messed with us," Daniel said. "Why close the cooler again?" I asked. "To mess with us more." It sounded thin even as he said it. No food was taken, nothing was broken, no attempt was made to get inside the tents beyond those light zipper pulls. That's what stayed with me. Whoever or whatever interacted with our campsite didn't take anything, didn't escalate, didn't try to force entry. It felt less like theft and more like checking, like someone testing how we would respond. I've taken students on overnight field trips before. I've watched them test boundaries just to see where the line is. That's what it felt like. An object moved to see if we'd notice. A second movement to see if we'd question ourselves. Then a quiet test of the barrier between inside and outside. We left that morning without ever seeing another person. I still camp. Daniel still camps. But now, when something small is out of place, I don't rush to explain it away. I take it seriously. Because sometimes the unsettling part isn't damage or confrontation. It's the sense that something interacted with your space carefully and decided not to go further. I don't camp to prove anything. I do it because my job is loud and crowded, and sometimes I want space that doesn't expect anything from me. In October of 2018, a guy I worked with told me about a clearing outside Flagstaff that he'd used a few times. He said it wasn't an official site, just a wide spot off a forest road where people didn't usually bother to stop. That sounded fine to me. The drive-in took longer than I thought it would. The paved road narrowed into gravel, then into a dirt track that dipped and rose without warning. Pine branches brushed along the sides of my truck in a few places. I slowed down to avoid scraping anything important. After about half an hour of steady driving past the last sign of traffic, I saw an opening on the left. It was a decent-sized clearing, flat enough to pitch a tent without fighting the ground. Tall pines spaced out around the edges. You could see into the woods, but not far enough to feel exposed. There wasn't a built fire ring, which usually means the spot isn't heavily used. I parked with the front of the truck facing back toward the road. I always do that out of habit. It makes leaving easier. I set my tent up about 20 feet from the truck, near a pair of trees that broke the wind but didn't block my view of the clearing. Before unpacking fully, I walked the edge of the clearing once. I didn't see any fresh tire tracks other than mine. No trash. No obvious footprints in the dirt. The ground was covered in dry pine needles, which don't hold impressions well. I built a small fire as the sun started dropping. The air was cool enough to make it comfortable to sit near it. The sky went from light blue to gray to something darker behind the trees. The forest changed as the light drained out of it. Tree trunks became vertical lines without detail. That's when I noticed a shape between two trees at the far edge of the clearing. It looked like a person standing still. It was taller than the brush around it and darker than the trunks beside it. The outline wasn't sharp, but it didn't look like a branch or a stump. It looked upright. I assumed someone else had driven in after me and parked farther down the road. Maybe they'd walked up to see if the clearing was occupied. I stood there watching for a moment, expecting it to move. It didn't. I shifted a few steps to the right to change my angle. The shape stayed in roughly the same place relative to the trees. "Hey," I called out, not loud, just enough to make it clear I'd seen something. There was no answer. I took another step and the shape disappeared behind the tree line. It didn't walk across the clearing. It didn't step forward. It was there, then it wasn't. I listened for movement in the brush. I didn't hear any. The light was almost gone at that point. I told myself it was easy to misread shadows when your eyes are adjusting. I've done enough late-night work to know how depth changes when contrast drops. Once it was fully dark, I couldn't see that far into the trees anyway. I ate, cleaned up, and put everything scented inside the truck. I locked the doors and checked them manually. I put the fire out before getting into my tent. The night was quiet. No wind. No distant engines. The kind of quiet that feels steady rather than empty. I fell asleep without much trouble. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. At first I thought it was an animal passing through. That happens anywhere with trees, but the sound didn't cut across the clearing. It traced along the outer edge. Footsteps, not right next to the tent, not brushing against it, somewhere out near the tree line. I stayed still and listened. The steps were spaced evenly, not the uneven pattern of a deer shifting its weight, not the quick, light movement of something small. Each step pressed into the pine needles with the same rhythm. They moved in an arc. I tried to picture where the sound was relative to the truck and the tent. It seemed to circle the clearing without coming straight in. I cleared my throat loudly, just to see what would happen. The footsteps stopped. I waited. After a short pause, they started again. Same distance, same pace. There was no beam of light cutting through the trees. No glow from a phone screen. Whoever was out there wasn't using anything visible from where I lay. I considered unzipping the tent and shining my flashlight out. I didn't want to step out and meet something I couldn't clearly see beyond the beam. I also didn't want to signal exactly where I was inside the tent. The steps continued for a while, then faded gradually until I couldn't separate them from the natural background noise. I stayed awake longer after that, listening for another pass. None came. When I stepped out of the tent in the morning, the clearing looked ordinary again. Sunlight flattened everything into something familiar. The trees were just trees. I walked the perimeter where I'd heard the movement. The ground was mostly dry needles over hard-packed dirt. In a few spots, the top layer looked slightly disturbed, but there weren't clear prints I could identify. Then I noticed tire tracks behind my truck that weren't mine. The tread pattern was different. My tires have a distinct block design. These had a wider spacing and a slightly different shape along the edges. The tracks angled into the clearing just enough that whoever was in that vehicle would have had a direct view of my tent. They didn't cross mine. They approached from the road, paused near the edge of the clearing, then turned back out. I walked along them to the road. The dirt there was looser, and the impressions were still defined. I stood there for a moment trying to recall whether I'd heard an engine during the night. I hadn't. But if someone cut their engine before reaching the clearing and let the vehicle roll the rest of the way, it might not have carried far. I loaded my gear into the truck, without taking my time. I didn't leave anything behind. Before getting in, I looked once more at the pair of trees where I'd seen the shape at dusk. In daylight, the spacing between them was clear. The shadows were gone. It was easier to see how a person could stand there without being immediately obvious from the center of the clearing. I got in the truck and started the engine. Driving back down the forest road, I kept my attention on the path ahead. The branches brushed the sides again in the same places. The road dipped and rose the same way it had on the way in. The clearing disappeared behind the trees after the first turn. I haven't gone back to that spot. If you realize tonight that the scariest part wasn't the darkness, but how close someone could stand without making a sound, go ahead, smash that like button, hit subscribe so you never miss the next nightmare, and tell me which story messed with you the most. Now imagine this. You don't wake up to the threat. You walk straight into it. Click now to watch 4 disturbing hiking horror stories, because the deeper you go, the fewer witnesses you have. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next night.